Okay, I think we're live. And today, or tonight rather, I'd like to explore Surah 51. And this is entitled The Scatterers, and it has a very poetic, alliterative title. It's also known as The Winnowing Winds. Hey, GW. So it has a very, very nice title, and the title is taken from the first verse, which says, "I swear by the wind that scatters far and wide, then those clouds bearing the load of minute things in space." It's presumably referring to space particles, dust, and um, things that are just cosmic dust and rock. Then those ships that glide easily, then those angels who distribute blessings by our command. What you are threatened with is most surely true, and the judgment must most surely come about. I swear by the heaven full of ways, most surely you are at variance with each other in what you say. Now, I'm just going to go back to the beginning here, and this is one of the weirdest aspects of the Quran. And I've pointed this out in the past few videos, the idea of swearing to not only inanimate objects, but natural uh, natural processes, things like the wind or the air, um, swearing on the Quran, swearing on this and that. And I explained how unscriptural this is, but how it's in keeping with Islam, the idea of not taking oaths seriously. And it's just an illustration of how mendacious Muhammad was, how interested he was in dissimulation and lying. He needed to keep, and also how little evidence there was to support his assertions, to support the truth claims of the Quran. He kept continually, he needed to keep averring that he's telling the truth, and he's swearing that this is true and this is going to come to pass, in spite of the fact that he had a record of failed prophecies. The biblical test for prophethood was one that he failed. Uh, and this is something that's manifest if you read the Quran and you compare the Quran with history, with what actually happened. You'll find that Muhammad was a completely failed prophet, but you see him doing this repeatedly. But also, the fact that he's swearing at all is an indication that he had no real understanding of the Bible, much less that he's swearing by the wind. Now, if you go to Deuteronomy 4, God is this is a list of things that God is telling the Jewish people that they shouldn't do, and he's explaining why they shouldn't do it, because they'll corrupt themselves. And he's telling this to Moses, and Moses once again is telling it to his people. So in verse 4:16 it says, "Lest ye corrupt yourselves and make you a graven image, the similitude of any figure, the likeness of male or female, the likeness of any beast that is on the earth, the likeness of any winged fowl that flieth in the air, the likeness of anything that creepeth on the ground, the likeness of any fish that is in the waters beneath the earth." And this is the interesting part. This is what demonstrates that the Quran is nonsense. "And lest thou lift up thine eyes unto heaven, and when thou seest the sun, the moon, and the stars, even all the host of heaven, shouldest be driven to worship them and serve them, which the Lord thy God hath divided unto all nations under the heaven. But the Lord hath taken you and brought you forth out of the iron furnace, even out of Egypt, to be unto him a people of inheritance, as ye are this day. And this is reaffirmed in the New Testament when Paul describes uh, why Israel was punished and why God allowed them to be exiled. So in Romans 1:25, it says, "Who changed the truth of God." Um, in 24 rather, it says, "Wherefore God also gave them up to uncleanness through the lusts of their own hearts, to dishonor their own bodies between themselves, who changed the truth of God into a lie, and worshipped and served the creature more than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen." So uh, Islam is a perfect illustration of this, of people who are worshiping creation rather than the Creator. And you can see it in a million different ways. Just looking at the Islamic conception of heaven or paradise and comparing it to the biblical description of heaven, there's no similarity. There's absolutely no similarity. The Islamic version of paradise is a place where you can indulge in all these carnal, sinful behaviors, and God is more or less absent. Whereas uh, heaven is a place where you're at rest, not only at rest from all of the consequences of sin, but um, also sin itself. It's absent in Islamic paradise. Sin is still there, but it's been sanctioned. It's been given the imprimatur of acceptance because the people who are doing it are Muslims and were uh, were um, were accepted into heaven by virtue of the fact that Allah decreed it. So they can still go on and do all these things that are sinful. Whereas in heaven, sin is non-existent. It's not there, and the desire for sin is absent as well. So that's just one example. So he's swearing in this first verse. He's swearing by the wind. Um, he's swearing by the wind, by the clouds. But he's swearing by things which Moses told his people that they're not allowed to do. He told them that they shouldn't give up their affection for the creator and start worshiping creation, and that if they did, they would be punished for it. And this is something that God made very clear, and this is one of the reasons that Israel was dispossessed of the land and exiled, because they started worshiping false gods, and they engaged in idolatry, and they started worshiping the world and and creation the rather than the creator who created the world. And it's amazing when you think about it. So this is uh this story is called the winnowing winds, and Muhammad here is establishing he's affirming this based on the wind, uh, the thing that is an aspect of um, of our universe, of our planet. He's saying you can trust me because I'm swearing by the wind. He's not even swearing by Allah. So he's saying you should put your trust in the wind. And when you look at the Bible, there there are numerous references to the wind, but they're almost always references to something that's ephemeral, or uh, that's ephemeral, that's evanescent, that doesn't really have any sort of stability. So, for example, Job says, "My life is as the wind," and Elijah, when he's retreated and and he's retreated into a cave, and God comes to him in the wind, but it's not, God isn't in the wind. The wind simply creates an earthquake, which creates a fire, and eventually God speaks to him in a still small voice. So the wind is just a vehicle, or an agent. It's not God. But here you have, and Jesus, of course, uses the wind in the Gospel of John, chapter 3. He used the wind as an analogy for the Holy Spirit. People don't know where the wind is going to rest, in the same way that you don't know who's going to be born again. So he uses it as an analogy, but nowhere in the Bible does it say that you should worship the wind, or that you should swear by the wind, because it's just the wind. The wind, rain, all of these things are simply facets of the natural world, which was created by God, and you shouldn't worship them in the same way that you have um, in animism. These things are venerated, so you don't have people worshiping one monotheistic God so much as you have people worshiping aspects of nature, but particularly in things like Shintoism, where they also believe inanimate objects have spirits. So animism, spiritism, Shintoism, a lot of these folk religions and animistic religions, they worship aspects of nature. So in this way, Islam is actually a lot closer to its pagan roots than to any sort of Abrahamic understanding of God, because Abraham, of course, rejected idols and idolatry, and was pulled out of a pagan land by God, and chosen to be the father of God's people, God's elect people. So it's kind of the antithesis of the faith of Abraham, and it's much closer to these pagan animistic religions, which is understandable when you realize how much Islam has incorporated aspects of these pre-Islamic pagan beliefs. So I just wanted to address that, first of all, the idea that this entire surah begins by swearing to the wind, not even swearing to Allah, but swearing to the wind, and how this is completely unscriptural. It's not. It doesn't have any sort of basis in the Bible whatsoever. So it continues, and we ended with verse 8, which says, "Most surely you are at variance with one another and what you say." And again, I explained why this is not a persuasive argument for Islam, even if Jews and Christians differ in their interpretation of the Bible and their interpretation of who the Messiah is, and whom is being referred to in messianic verses, and who Jesus Christ was. Even if they differ in those points, that still doesn't provide any evidence that Muhammad is right. Even if you can disprove both of them, which I don't think you can disprove the deity of Christ, and Muhammad certainly wasn't successful in his attempt to do so. But even if you could, it wouldn't necessarily lead to the conclusion that Islam is correct, because Muhammad doesn't provide any evidence that it is. He's simply saying these two people disagree, therefore they must both be wrong, which is a logical fallacy. You could have people who disagree about, say, to use a really ridiculous example. If you have two people, one says the Earth is flat, and the other says the Earth is an oblate spheroid, and a third person says, well, actually, the Earth is a hologram or projection. That third person, even if you can prove, even if the, um, even but even though he disagrees with the other two, it doesn't mean that he's correct. Obviously, there's a correct answer. I mean, the Earth is not flat, but the fact that those two people are arguing doesn't mean that the third person with a completely illogical um, assertion is correct. So in 9 it says, he is turned away from it who would be turned away. Um, uh, he's turned. Cursed be the liars, and this is another ironic passage from the Quran, considering that we're basically on page 350, and Muhammad has lied hundreds of times up to this point. Who are in the gulf of ignorance and neglectful? They ask, when is the day of judgment? It is the day on which they shall be tried at the fire. Taste your persecution. This is what you should hasten. That this is what you would hasten on. And this is another recurring theme in the Quran. This idea that people um, want to hasten the day of judgment, or unbelievers, i.e., non-Muslims, want to expedite the day of judgment. And this is something you see in the Quran repeatedly, and Muhammad really doesn't provide any sort of explanation. Now, in the Bible, there are verses about people who are looking forward to the day of the Lord and are going to be disappointed because they have these are people who profess a belief in Jehovah and believe that they're worshiping Jehovah, but really aren't. And of course, they're going to be uh, disappointed by the way that God treats them, or deals with these people in Israel. But when what Muhammad is saying is basically Jews and Christians and anyone who's not a Muslim is trying to expedite the day of the Lord, but he never explains why this should be. It's just, again, it's another verse that's devoid of context, and you see this in this surah, how Muhammad flits from one idea to the next, or one narrative, one broken narrative, and then just continues on onto a completely separate narrative with no connective tissue. There's nothing linking the two. So in 15 it says, surely those who guard against evil shall be in gardens and fountains, taking what their Lord gives them. Surely they were before that the doers of good. Uh, And in the morning they asked forgiveness, and in their property was a portion due to him who begs and to him who is denied, in parentheses, good. And in the earth there are signs for those who are sure, and in your own souls too. Will you not see? And in the heaven is your sustenance and what you were threatened with. Well, and by the Lord of the heavens and the earth, it is most surely the truth, just as you do speak. And again, I pointed this out repeatedly, but it's true. Muhammad completely this he, he completely ignores the need for any sort of empirical evidence that he is a prophet, and he just keeps saying this is true, and Allah is the one true God, and I am his prophet, and this is true, and he keeps repeating this, but he never provides any sort of evidence. In fact, to the contrary, like I said, almost all of his prophecies failed miserably. And the fact is, if you're Oh no, did I freeze? Uh, can you hear me? Oh, oh, okay. Did the stream just freeze? Okay. Uh, it froze on my end. Anyway, no, my point was he just keeps repeating this ad nauseum, but he doesn't provide any evidence, and his prophecies fail. And like I said, according to the Bible, if you're a prophet and something you say does not come to pass, then the people have no obligation to listen to you. In fact, under the Mosaic law, if someone was a false prophet, they would be stoned. And you hear this repeatedly, but it's true. Muhammad would not have been able to survive if he was traveling in the wilderness uh, with Moses and Aaron and Joshua and Caleb and Miriam. He would never have survived because he would have been exposed as a false prophet. So in 24, and this is where the narrative comes back to Abraham, and I've explained in previous videos how distorted this particular narrative is. And when people say Muslims have another Jesus, they don't just have another Jesus, they have another Abraham. They even have another Lot. The Lot in the Quran is he's depicted almost like uh, John MacArthur or some he's reproving people for sin. It's a completely unbiblical conception of who this person is, and the Quran even misunderstands his relationship to the people of Sodom. He calls that they're described as his people, which they're not. Uh, Lot was a Jew. He parted from Abraham and made his camp in the gate of Sodom, but he was still a Jew. These weren't his people, so the Quran gets that wrong. But it also completely distorts who Abraham was. And as I said in Surah 21, the prophets, he turns Abraham into an idolater, basically. And I'll just read that verse again. Let me see if I can find it. Um, so in verse 58, this is what Abraham does with the idols. So he broke them into pieces, except, and this is the key verse, the key part of this verse, except the chief of them, that haply they may return to it. So in other words, Abraham destroyed all of the idols except for one idol, which he told them to worship. So this is basically Muhammad retconning himself back into the biblical narrative of Abraham and turning Abraham into Muhammad, basically an idolater, but a less conspicuous idolater than his co-religionists. So instead of having monotheism, you have something closer to monolatry, or worshiping one chief god, but the other gods still exist in this universe, in the sense that you're taking one idol out of many and worshiping it, but you're still worshiping an idol. You're not worshiping God. And and the Quran continually comes back to this story and continually distorts and butchers this story. So in 24, it it says, "Has there come to you information about the honored guests of Ibrahim?" Now this is referring to, of course, Abraham being visited on the plains of Mamre. Let me just turn to this in Genesis 18. And the Lord appeared unto him in the plains of Mamre, and he sat in the tent door in the heat of the day, and he lift up his eyes and looked, and lo, 3 men stood by him. And when he saw them, he ran to meet them from the tent door and bowed himself toward the ground and said, My Lord, if now I have found favor in thy sight, pass not away, I pray thee, from thy servant. Let a little water, I pray you, he fetched, and wash your feet, and rest yourselves under the tree. And I will fetch a morsel of bread, and comfort ye your hearts. After that ye shall pass on, for therefore are ye come to your servant. And they said, So do as thou hast said. And Abraham hastened into the tent unto Sarah and said, Make ready quickly 3 measures of fine meal, knead it, and make cakes upon the hearth. And Abraham ran unto the herd and fetched a calf tender and good, and gave it unto a young man, and he hasted to dress it. And he took butter and milk and the calf which he had dressed, and set it before them. And he stood by them under the tree, and they did eat. So that's the biblical portion. That's Genesis 18, and it's important for a number of reasons. One of them being that this is an indication of the triune nature of God. So Abraham looks up and he sees 3 men, so 3 persons he sees. And you have to remember, in the previous preceding verse, he says the Lord appeared unto him. So in other words, these 3 men are representing the Lord. These 3 men. And remember, this is something that Islam repeatedly denies. The Quran is replete with these anti-Trinitarian verses, these verses denying the triune nature of God. Denying the fact that there is a multiplicity of persons within the Godhead. So you have in Genesis 18 a complete and utter refutation of this. But look at how the Quran distorts this this chapter. So, has there come to you information about the honored guests of Ibrahim? When they entered upon him, they said, Peace, peace, said he, a strange people. Then he turned aside to his family secretly and brought a fat roasted calf. So already Muhammad is changing and altering. Hi Alejandro, Inky, Love and Light, Andrew. Already Muhammad is distorting the passage. So he brought it near them. He said, What? Will you not eat? So again, Muhammad embroiders whenever you have some sort of biblical narrative that Muhammad is recounting, he distorts it. He also embroiders it and adds things that aren't there. He takes out things that are there. He twists the circumstances that are described. So he conceived in his mind a fear on account of them. They said, Fear not. And they gave him the good news of a boy possessing knowledge. So let's continue in Genesis 18 from there. And they said unto him, Where is Sarah thy wife? And he said, Behold, in the tent. And he said, I will certainly return unto thee according to the time of life. And lo, Sarah thy wife shall have a son. So referring to Isaac here. And Sarah heard it in the tent door, which was behind him. Now Abraham and Sarah were old and well stricken in age, and it ceased to be with Sarah after the manner of women. Therefore Sarah laughed within herself, saying, After I am waxed old, shall I have pleasure, my Lord being old also? And the Lord said unto Abraham, Wherefore did Sarah laugh, saying, Shall I of a surety bear a child which am old? Is anything too hard for the Lord? At the time appointed I will return unto thee according to the time of life, and Sarah shall have a son. Then Sarah denied, saying, I laughed not, for she was afraid. And he said, Nay, but thou didst laugh. And the men rose up from thence and looked towards Sodom, and Abraham went with them to bring them on their way. So let's look at how the Quran treats this. Then his wife came up in great grief, and she struck her face, and she said, An old barren woman. And again, so you see, Muhammad just consistently embroiders and falsifies and just distorts whatever biblical narrative there is in the text. And as I pointed out, the story of Joseph is probably the most accurately rendered biblical narrative, and he still completely butchers that. He changes the entire point of that narrative. The description of Potiphar's wife, her relationship with Joseph. Joseph, it is described almost like he's trying to seduce her. It's really bizarre. But even more so with Abraham, which is a fundamental point because Muslims continually refer to themselves as belonging to an Abrahamic religion. And you even see these stupid multi-faith or interfaith commercials or events where you have a rabbi and usually some kind of Methodist or Episcopalian minister and an imam describing their relationship with Abraham as the father of faith. But the thing is, Abraham was not the father of Islam. Islam has no connection to Abraham, and you can see it when you actually read how the Quran describes Abraham and how the Quran treats um, Genesis 12 through 20, treats these chapters, the most important chapters involving Abraham and his wife Sarah, and also Lot. Uh, it has a completely skewed understanding of who Abraham is. So they can't say they're descendants from Abraham simply because Muhammad shoved the name Ibrahim into a bunch of chapters in the Quran. So he embellishes and invents this scene with Sarah. They said, "Thus says your Lord, surely he is the wise, the knowing." He said, "What is your affair then, O messengers?" They said, "Surely we are sent to a guilty people." And here is Muhammad's version of the rest of Genesis 18, where the three men who represent God tell him what's going to happen to Sodom, and Abraham um, gets into a kind of like a bargaining contest with God and tries to whittle down the number of people who who are righteous, who might be righteous in the town. So initially uh, and the Lord, this is verse 26, and the Lord said, "If I find in Sodom 50 righteous within the city, then I will spare all the place for their sakes." And Abraham answered and said, "Behold, now I have taken upon me to speak unto the Lord, which am but dust and ashes. Peradventure, peradventure there shall lack 5 of the 50 righteous. Wilt thou destroy all the city for lack of 5? And he said, If I find there 40 and 5, I will not destroy it. And he spake unto him yet again, and said, Peradventure there shall be 40 found there. And that I will not do it for 40's sake. And he said unto him, O let not the Lord be angry, and I will speak. Peradventure there shall 30 be found there. And he said, I will not do it if I find 30 there. And he said, Behold now, I have taken upon me to speak unto the Lord. Peradventure there shall be 20 found there. And he said, I will not destroy it for 20's sake. And he said, O let not the Lord be angry, and I will speak yet but this once. Peradventure 10 shall be found there. And he said, I will not destroy it for 10's sake. And the Lord went his way as soon as he had left communing with Abraham, and Abraham returned unto his place. So what does the Quran do? It says, surely we are sent to a guilty people. And this is verse 33. 33 says that we may send down upon them stone of clay. And this is, I guess this is the Quran's interpretation of brimstone. Sent forth from your Lord for the extravagant. Then we brought forth such as were therein of the believers, but we did not find therein even a single house of those who submitted to the Muslims. And the Muslims here is in parentheses because Muslims believe, because they believe Muhammad was truthful, that Abraham and Lot and all of these people, dating back even to Adam, was supposedly a Muslim. So and again, this is one of the things that is really really baffling about Islam because on the one hand they say everyone is born a Muslim. So when someone converts to Islam, they're not converting, they're reverting to their essential nature, which is good because they don't believe in the fall of man. But also if you read the Quran, Muhammad says he was the first to submit to Allah. So which is it? Is Muhammad the first Muslim? Because that's what that statement implies, that if you're the first to submit to Allah, that means you are the first Muslim. So was Muhammad the first Muslim, or was Abraham the first Muslim? Because here it says, uh, not a single house of those who submitted, i.e., the Muslims. So apparently, Muslims existed at the time of Abraham, and there were no Muslims found in Sodom. But again, this contradicts the idea of Lot being saved, because Lot is, in fact, he's called righteous Lot by Paul, uh, but he was saved, and his daughters. So obviously, there were some Muslims. There was at least one house. There weren't. Obviously, there were not the requisite number to actually spare the city. There weren't 10, but there must have been some Muslims because, of course, Lot survived. Lot and his daughters, and we left them there in the sign for those who fear the painful punishment. And in Musa, so here the Quran transitions straight into another story, another very popular story that the Quran bowdlerizes and distorts. When we sent him to Pharaoh, i.e., Pharaoh, with clear authority, but he turned away with his forces and said, "A magician or a madman." This is Pharaoh. So we seized him and his hosts and hurled them into the sea, and he was blamable. And this is the parting of the Red Sea. And in Ad, when we sent upon them the destructive wind, and it did not leave aught which it blew. So here's a reference to the title of the surah, the scatterers, or the winnowing wind. When we sent upon them the destructive wind, and it did not leave aught on which it blew, but it made it like ashes. And in Samud, when it was said to them, "Enjoy yourselves for a while," but they revolted against the commandment of their Lord. So the rumbling overtook them while they saw. So they were not able to rise up, nor could they defend themselves. And the people of Nah, i.e., Noah, before, surely they were a transgressing people. And the heaven we raised it high with power, and most surely we are the markers of things ample. So Ad was a civilization in the Arabian Peninsula, in the Hejaz specifically. Or Samud was a civilization in the Hejaz that existed from the 8th century BC up until the time, more or less, of Muhammad, that disappeared. And Ad is supposedly an Arabian civilization that was destroyed by basically by natural events, like natural storms or weathers, and Muhammad attributes this to Allah. So again, he's mixing folklore, Arabian folklore, with actual history, and he's attributing all of these things, the fact that these two tribes dissipated and basically became extinct as distinct people groups or tribes. They basically disappeared, like the Hittites or the Amorites. He's basically claiming that the reason for that is because they disobeyed Allah. But again, he's not offering any sort of evidence, but it does ground the Quran more firmly in Arabia. And this was something that Muhammad was very eager to do. The fact that the people he was trying to proselytize were Arabs who spoke Arabic, and he wanted to make it seem like Allah had prioritized them over anyone else. And again, this is an idea that's very unscriptural. So if you read the Bible, particularly the Old Testament, God makes it clear that He has a people, the Jews or Israel. He's chosen them, but it's not because they're special or because they're better. And in fact, He says they're the least numerous. There are people that are much bigger than them. Particularly the Canaanites, the people whose land they possessed, that God told them to, that God promised to Abraham and his descendants. They were much more numerous. They were more powerful, but God chose them specifically to be His people to achieve His purpose. He didn't choose Israel because they were so much better or more moral or ethical or more imposing in terms of like projecting military power. He chose them because he wanted to achieve his will. So this is the same idea as salvation. You're not chosen by God because you're better than the people around you, or there's something special or unique about you that would make you preferred over someone who's unsaved. Who you're chosen because of the design of God, or the decision. You're chosen by God, and this applied corporately to Israel. But the Quran takes this idea and turns it on its head. So Muhammad repeatedly says that the Arabs are special, and God wants them to win these military battles, and they're superior to all of the other people. And that's the reason um, that's the reason the Muslims, that's the reason that they've obtained all of this land and power, and it's because of Allah, and Allah chose them specifically their because of their race and their fealty to Muhammad. And this is the complete opposite. Like I said, it takes this idea you find in scripture of God exercising his sovereign will, and it inverts it and turns it on its head. So you have Muslims are Muslims because they're special, and Allah is protecting them to the extent that He is, because. Oh, hi, Jim. Thanks. Yeah, like, share if you find this interesting. I know some people find these videos too long, and I do have to tighten it up a little bit. But I'm glad you're here. But yeah, so he takes this idea and he completely inverts it and turns it on its head. This idea of the Muslims, particularly the Arabs, the Muslims of Arabia, being preferred. And this is why you see in Islam, if you become a Muslim, you have to dress like an Arab, you have to speak Arabic, and you have to listen to God's, quote unquote, God's word in a foreign language. And this is why most Muslims can't read the Quran, because they're told um, any translation of the Quran is a bastardization of that, and it dilutes the message, and it's not a real Quran. I mean, and this is very convenient for Muslims, because it prevents millions of people from learning how um, it prevents millions of people from learning how bizarre and ridiculous Islam is if you can't read your supposed holy book in your own language. But that's what we have to do. If you're a Muslim, you have to dress like an Arab, you have to talk like an Arab, and there's a pecking order, a hierarchy in Islam, where Arabs, particularly Arabs who are in the Arabian Peninsula, who are in the Hejaz, Mecca, from Muhammad's tribe are preferred above everyone else. And this is why whenever you have the leader of a jihadist group like the late Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, they try to trace their lineage back to Muhammad because this is considered a um, a royal line. It's like it's like their version of being a Levite, which begs the question: why did they get translated in the first place? That's a good thing. That's a good question. What's the point of Muhammad Hijab and Ali Dawa and all of these other bozos practicing Dawa in English if you can't understand the Quran? Um, First of all, even the Quran in Arabic is a translation. The, Today's Arabic is not the Arabic of antiquity. One of the reasons the Quran is important is because it's one of the first books that actually was written in this language, and but it's not the same language. This would be the equivalent, and I used this analogy before, of someone in Greece now saying, "Well, you have to read the Bible or the New Testament in Greek because it was written in Koine Greek." But the thing is, if you're reading a Greek Bible in today's Greek, it's not the same language. It's derived from the same language, but it's not the same as reading a Bible written, reading um, one of the original copies of the New Testament, which would be written in an antiquated or an archaic form of Greek. So this is what Muslims are saying. Even Muslims who read the Quran in Arabic, they're not reading it in the same type of Arabic in which it was written, because it was written 12 uh, over 12 centuries ago. But again, it doesn't make any sense to say that on the one hand you can't understand the Quran if it's not written in Arabic, but then go out and try to make proselytes with English dawa like these bozos, Ali Dawa and Muhammad Hijab, and there are hundreds of them. Those conversions or reversions are false if we hold you to your word, the idea that the Quran needs to be written in Arabic, because they're not understanding what they're converting to or reverting to. Um, but yeah, that's basically the point I wanted to make here. The idea that you have to become an Arab basically if you want to become a Muslim. Whereas, so it's not a universal religion. A it's not a Catholic or universal religion. It's not something that you can. It's uh, a very prejudiced, very um, introverted type of cult, basically, where you have to become an Arab. And V.S. Nepal points this out in his books Among the Believers, which was published, I think, in 1980, and Beyond Belief, which was published 2 decades later, around like 1998. So he went to 4 non-Arabic Muslim countries: Malaysia, Pakistan, Indonesia, and Iran. And he demonstrated this by going, watching people convert to Islam, watching how Islam was practiced in there, basically how this Arabic culture had infested these countries and distorted all of their customs and kind of messed with people's identities. So they felt an inferiority complex if they were from Indonesia or Malaysia, or even to a lesser extent Pakistan, but particularly Iran. And you still see this conflict, even though Islam conquered Iran over a millennia ago, a millennium ago. There's still this conflict between the Arab Muslim interlopers, as it were, and the native Persian population, which existed and was conquered. You still have this tension, and this is this is the problem with Islam. In order to be a Muslim, you have to adopt a completely foreign identity. Whereas when someone becomes a follower of Christ, they don't. It doesn't matter. You can still be a like me, like a New Yorker or a New Yorker and an American, or if you're in Bihar, India, you can still eat Indian food and dress like dress like someone from that state. Or if you're a believer in who came from Korea, it doesn't mean you have to stop speaking Korean or stop dressing or eating Korean, stop eating kimchi and Korean cuisine. So you don't have to abandon your heritage or be transformed into a different person in order to adopt Christ. Um, Muslims in Houston still eat taco. Touche. Um, yeah, that's another good point. In Bosnia, after the Bosnian War, particularly, and the Kosovo War, you had Saudi money flowing in, building mosques, trying to impose this Wahhabist version of Islam. And that's what you see around the world, basically, increasingly a very flat Arabic Salafist version of Islam, because Islam kind of paves over whatever uniqueness or specific cultural identities people had. This is why this is why you can go to Pakistan and you go in a mosque and you hear people, the muezzin is speaking in Arabic. It's why you have people in Bosnia or Kosovo going to mosques that were built by Saudi Arabia, and look. So it's basically a flattening out of people's uniqueness and their unique cultural identity. And I mean, that's just one of the many ways Islam is bad, and it's one of it refutes this idea that Islam is a universal religion, which Muslims continually say. When you actually look at it, it really isn't a universal religion. It's a very particularistic, very um, uh, just very introverted cult, albeit one with many millions and millions of members and devotees. So, and just this continues on, the heaven and the earth, and we made it to a wide extent. Therefore, fly to Allah. Surely I am a plain warner to you from Him. And do not set up Allah with another God. Surely I am a plain warner to you from Him. And again, this is another attempt to dispute the idea of a Trinitarian a Trinitarian God. Thus did not come to those before them an apostle, but they said, a magician or a madman. Have they charged each other with this? Nay, they are an inordinate people. Then turn your back upon them, for you are not to blame. And again, there's something that completely contradicts all of the other admonitions in Islam. And this is, I should have said this before, but the scatterers, this surah, Surah 51, is a Meccan surah. So this is so when you find things like this in the Quran, you find points where Muhammad is telling people to just warn people about Islam and to accept Islam, but not to force it on them. But all of the verses you see where Muhammad tells you to fight them and to coerce them and to force them to accept Islam, these were all written later on. They were never abrogated. So these are the verses used by these are the verses that are still incumbent upon Muslims today in the 21st century. and continue to remind, for surely the reminder profits the believers. But again, this is not what Islam does. It doesn't just remind you. It's not like the Jehovah's Witnesses or other cults that just come to your door or try to get you to accept their heretical literature. They forcibly try to convert you, and that's another thing. The mosque in Cologne, they have Turkish. Um, you have Turkish people there that are like, it's like a fifth column. A lot of them, and you had this in the U.S. too during Erdogan's visit. You had Turks come and assault members of the Secret Service. And in Germany as well, you have Turks who attack Kurds who protested against the Turkish government. So I mean, it's a bad idea in general to not vet or not screen people who are coming into your country, but particularly when you have people coming into your country from a militaristic, very militant, very revanchist type religion like Islam. Uh, yeah, it totally distorts and deforms the legal system and the rights of citizens. And this was something that Ibn Warraq, the ex not ex but the apostate, he wrote in his book Why I'm Not a Muslim. And the first chapter is about Salman Rushdie and how the reaction to the Salman Rushdie affair, the fatwa issued by Ayatollah Khomeini, how that completely changed forever how the West deals with these threats. And it's why even now you can't you won't have publishers publishing books that are critical of Islam. You won't have people like Robert Spencer or Pamela Geller on talk shows to discuss this, because there's an informal but very hard censorship of any ideas that are critical of Islam, because they realize that there'll be violent reactions or there'll be political reactions. Countries like Pakistan or Libya or Saudi Arabia, they'll try to censor things diplomatically, but they'll try to stifle any sort of criticism of Islam. But to just finish off this surah, it says, and continue to remind, for surely the reminder profits the believers. And I already showed you how that's simply false. This is not what Islam does. And I have not created the jinn and the men except that they should serve me. I do not desire from them any sustenance, and I do not desire that they should feed me. Surely Allah is a bestower of sustenance, the Lord of power, the strong. So surely those who are unjust shall have a portion like the portion of their companions. Therefore, let them not ask me to hasten on. Therefore, woe to those who disbelieve because of the day which they are threatened with. So again, go back to 56. This is interesting because it says, "I did not create the jinn to serve, except that they should serve me." This again emphasizes the pagan roots of Islam. This idea of the jinn. The jinn are celestial creatures that are mentioned nowhere in the Bible. They're not. This is not an Arabic description of. This is not an Arabic description of seraphim or cherubim or any of the celestial beings in heaven. And another thing is Muhammad didn't really understand the distinction. So like he didn't understand the distinction between angels and seraphim. So the way he described them is completely contradictory and doesn't make any sorts of sense, because he didn't understand the distinctions between um these beings. But jinn are something completely foreign to the Bible. They're there's something that he adopted wholesale from pre-Islamic pagan Arab culture. This idea of jinns, or I would call them celestial creatures or powers. And this is where you get the word genie from. but these are basically spirits that take an active role in humans' lives. But again, these are not celestial beings in as described in the Bible. They're not part of the divine council. These are just basically cre- uh, pagan spirit beings that existed in Arabic in Arabic culture, and that Muhammad just adopted wholesale and imported into Islam. Um, so when Muslims say that Islam isn't a pagan religion, they're really struggling against the book that they're relying on. They're struggling. Um, they're struggling against the Quran because there are so many pagan aspects to this religion. Not only the fact that jinn exist, but the description of Abraham and how you can reconcile that with what Islam actually is, and the fact that there are all of these practices imported from the Sabians, the Umrah, the Hajj. Some of the five pillars of Islam are actually modified versions of rituals and practices of polytheistic and pagan tribes that that existed at the time of Muhammad. But the capper is the jinn is a basically pagan spirit. So you're basically combining one or two one or two aspects that are taken from Judaism or Christianity in a very badly butchered form, and combining that with all of these pagan practices and pagan ideas and folklore and ritual that existed in the Arabian Peninsula before Muhammad came about. So again, there's no good explanation. Muslims can't provide any justification for the existence of jinn and reconcile that with the Bible. It's not possible. But here he Allah explicitly states he's created the jinn. So he's basically creating these celestial creatures that don't exist. And it really, if you look at it, a lot of things in Islam can be compared to animism or Shintoism, these very naturalistic pagan practices that involve spirit beings or earth spirits. Um, anyway, I just wanted to finish that, and the next surah is Surah 52, the mountain, and they do get shorter. Most of the rest are either 2 pages or shorter. Some are 2.5, but they basically just get shorter and shorter all the way up until, let me see where, all the way up until I would say Surah. Let me see, Surah 75, I would say. And after that, it's basically like a page and a half. So I might combine a lot of these, say the last 30 or so surahs, I might just combine them into one or two videos when we get there. But we'll get to that eventually. There's a conference called Heart for Muslims. You can search for it. There's a YouTube channel, I think, that has some information, but there's also a website, heartformuslims.com, where you can get all the details. It's happening on Saturday. I know most of you are not nowhere near New York City, but for those of you that are or in the tri-state area, you can come say hi to me. But anyway, or share it with your friends if they're in the vicinity. Anyway, I'll see you next time.